Hello and welcome to our latest HRZone conversation in partnership with workplace technology provider HubStar. I'm Becky Norman, the managing editor of HRZone, and today we're going to be talking about a pretty contentious issue, the return to office mandate, and also more broadly around hybrid working policies and how wildly they can differ really from the reality of how and where people work in your organisation. So to talk through these topics, I'm delighted to be joined by Jane Young, who is VP of Growth and Head of the Future of Work at HubStar. Jane is an acclaimed speaker on change in the future of work. She's delivered keynotes for the likes of Deloitte, Pfizer and Microsoft, and has worked with a diverse range of organisations from tech startups and scale-ups to renowned brands. Jane, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Becky. I'm happy to be here.
So before we get stuck into RTO mandates and hybrid working, could you tell us a little bit more about your role at HubStar?
Yeah, sure. Well, a big part of that is really helping customers and the wider market shape their workplace strategy, as well as shaping HubStar's strategy to bring the value that we deliver to the market in a way that resonates with the big priorities and challenges that are on their plates right now. Because there are these huge questions that I think everybody's wrestling with. How do we build connection in a world where mental health has just been tanking since around 2012? How do we build high-performance cultures when trust in institutions is at an all-time low? How do we build resilience and belonging when there's so much volatility and all this polarization and financial instability, fear of AI? And then from a business perspective, how do we stop wasting budget and emissions on workspaces that aren't delivering any value? You know, how can we reconfigure the workplace so it meets the needs of our people? How do we get our data in order so that we can make decisions based on reality rather than assumptions? How do we become more adaptable when change is just relentless? So that really involves creating frameworks and strategies and models that help leaders tackle these challenges, and then expressing that through the medium of webinars and podcasts and content, as well as advising leaders on how they can use technology to support these goals, which often involve simplifying and consolidating their tech stacks, getting their data house in order, and then plotting a course from wherever they are now at whatever level of readiness to where they want to be in terms of measurable workplace performance and all the cost savings and the people outcomes that are possible when you get that right.
Wow, a lot of stuff there. Some big issues. And yeah, I wish we could talk about them all. But I think, for the purposes of this discussion, we're just going to dive into hybrid working specifically.
Sounds good.
So starting with RTO mandates and their failings, they've been making the headlines really ever since we came out of the pandemic.
Yeah.
A couple of examples out of many that spring to mind. Amazon, around this time last year, they issued an RTO mandate to 2,000 people, and they ended up being short on 800 desks and only had, I think, 900 parking spaces for those people. So I'm sure chaos ensued there. Another example from Paramount, they issued a strict 5-day RTO mandate to their people, and that led to 600 deciding to leave, and that led to 185 million spent on severance packages. So from the outside in, that kind of gives the impression that a lot of RTO mandates are destined to fail. Is that the reality, or is that more of an exception that makes the headlines and shapes that narrative?
I do think there have been a lot of misleading clickbait headlines. Microsoft is an example of that. Oh my goodness, they're making everybody come back 3 days a week. They're forcing everybody back into the office. Whereas actually, when you look beneath the surface there, they already had a 2.5-day guideline, so it wasn't that much of a change. And then it only applied to people within a 50-mile radius of their nearest office, and this and that. And when it's done right, there might be a broad guideline, but there's a lot of exceptions and nuance beneath that surface. So the big clickbait headlines, I think that's been a huge distraction actually for leaders, because I mean, I've heard analysts say that, there's a big announcement about Amazon or one of these huge companies, and suddenly they get CEOs ringing them up saying, is this the way it's got to be? Is it? So we're being buffeted by the winds of change, when actually the evidence shows, in terms of research and from, acclaimed researchers at established universities and what have you, that strict full-time mandates are generally a bad thing. You'll find that it does cause quitting, and some organizations have even confessed to the fact that they've used strict mandates as a means to make people quit, sometimes reducing costs, unlike Paramount by the sounds of it, but reducing the cost they might have to pay for redundancies. So I think that's a terrible idea. I think it's a terrible idea to use mandates as a means to force people to quit. And it's usually, I've not seen a situation yet in which it's a good idea based on evidence in terms of performance and people outcomes to have very strict mandates and then punitive measures for not adhering to them, because what happens is the quitting doesn't happen evenly. There's some research that shows that it's the smartest, most capable, most experienced, highest value people that quit. And the problem with that is you'll be amazed how few people in an organization are the ones that do produce a whole lot of the good stuff. There's something called Price's Law. It's a bit like the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, but it's worse than that. Price's Law is the square root of the number of people involved in a creative endeavor do half of the work. Now imagine that on a scale of 10,000 people in an organization. It's a very small bunch of people who have a disproportionate effect on the performance and the results and the innovation and the good stuff. So if those people quit because they're the people not only who can get a job and they've got that confidence that they've got good skills in the market and they know they're good, high performers know that they're good at their job, but also it's very offensive to them. I think if you're a really high performer and you've been doing a really good job and somebody's telling you suddenly you need to do it in a certain way, that makes you feel like you're not trusted or maybe you're not respected. And so it's almost a bit more offensive. So I think the quitting thing is problematic in terms of the quitting being unevenly distributed. And all the evidence shows that there's no real benefit to having no flexibility whatsoever. And then to your point on the Amazon thing, I think that's happened with a few organizations. They've downsized their real estate, understandably so. And then they've not had the data to help them figure out what the consequence of that might be. So you might have people, it might be empty on Mondays and Fridays, and then everybody's coming in on the Wednesday, and lo and behold, they show up and there's no place to go. And that just shows you, if the company who can deliver a toothbrush to your door in 2 hours can't get this right, it shows you that it's hard. But it's kind of hard in the way that editing a movie with scissors and tape is hard. That if you have the right tools and systems and data to be able to model the consequences of those types of decisions, then you're less likely for that to be an issue. You would know that it's going to bust its banks in midweek, and then you'd take steps to even that out. Maybe you give some teams that they have to be in on the Monday. And so there's ways around it if you get your data straight to avoid that. And to be fair, on Amazon, they're absolutely massive, and that's very complex to get everything right. And sometimes you're going to trip over yourself. But I think generally speaking, mandates are not some evil thing if they're done right. But I think they work better as you scale as an organization. Smaller companies at earlier stages, that's where the growth is generally at in the economy. They want to hire people, they want to grow they want to get ahead, and therefore they're not fussed about mandates as much. They have a lot more flexibility because they want to have this global talent pool and be able to scale in a cost-effective way and get the talent they need. So the small end, they don't need to be so strict typically. But as you get a larger and more complex organization, it makes sense to have at least some sort of guideline. Most big guys are opting for 3 days a week structured hybrid. But that doesn't mean everybody must come in 3 days a week. Typically, it's a high level mandate. And then within that, there'll be many exceptions, and there'll be team agreements, and there'll be lots of nuance. So it only has to apply to people within this radius, or these people, or those people. So I think there just needs to be a bit of give, and not blanket one size fits all, and definitely not punitive measures. You don't want to be walking people to HR because they haven't come into the office. I think there's no upside to that whatsoever.
Yeah, there needs to be a bit of nuance there. But organisations are still struggling with this, aren't they? Every year they're looking to make refinements to their hybrid working policies. There seems to be a bit of a struggle with striking the right balance between what the business wants or thinks they need versus what the employee wants in terms of level of flexibility. You mentioned data as a really important point of maybe an issue that people aren't they don't have the right data to make the best decisions there. What other kind of hurdles are businesses facing as they're trying to get their hybrid policies working a little bit better?
Yeah, I think the data is a big one, because if you can't, and that goes in hand with tools, if you can't measure how often teams are coming in, then you have no visibility in terms of the gap between your policy and reality. And it's not about measuring people so that you can bash them with a stick if they're not doing the right thing. It's about understanding that gap so that you don't have to build, you don't have to have massive amounts of waste, for example. I mean, if you're trying to make sure you have the right workplaces and spaces and amenities and things for your people, and you've got this bunch of people and you're trying to make it a match, if you are assuming people are coming in way more than they actually are, you're going to be having all this underutilized space. Or if you're assuming people are coming in way less than they actually are, they might be showing up and not being able to get a place to sit that they will find fits their needs. So I think the data is important in matching the needs of the business and the needs of the people. And then in terms of the other thing I think people are struggling with, in some ways, it's a fixation on the magic number. It reminds me a bit of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. There's a supercomputer and it's, asks for the meaning of life in the universe or something, and it's 42. It's like, take all the complexity of the universe of every single individual employee, all their life circumstances, whether they have flatmates or family members to care for, how far they live away from the office, what their actual job role is, how they prefer to work, any neurodiversity. You take all that and you times that by 10,000 people, and you think you're going to come up with the magic answer. 3.
Yeah.
It's like, that's not life. So that's why I think the other thing they're struggling with is how to manage the nuance and the 8 shades of grey. And I think the way to do that is to try and have visibility. So instead of having one policy, I'd advocate for this idea of having a policy stack. So first of all, get alignment. So you've got HR people involved, workplace experience people. Some of them report to HR, some of them report into corporate real estate. There might be facilities people, IT people. So there's all these stakeholders that have different ideas. So if you align on what their priorities are in terms of workplace and what it should achieve, then that's a good sort of anchor. But then you can actually think, okay, well, there's this broad policy that we have that gives us guardrails. But then another stage of detail below that, there's maybe going to be certain segments. So maybe based on location or based on job role or based on however you want to segment it. But I think the real magic happens at the layer of team level agreements. Any given team is best placed to know how they should work. So I think that's where you can really get the nuance of like, well, actually, Becky has moved. She's now like 100 miles away from the office. Jane now lives in the Bahamas, and then we've got 3 other folk in our team who are really close to the office, but one of them has to be home at 4 o'clock to get the kids. You have all this detail at the team level. So I think a big thing that most companies are struggling with is that managers aren't trained to manage hybrid teams and to cope with this new reality. So they kind of maybe have an insecurity that they can't manage so well when they can't see people in the office, which doesn't really make much logical sense. It's more of a feeling. But the way to get around that, I think, is to teach managers to have these conversations with their teams. Talk about how you work. Talk about what a good meeting looks like and how you're going to manage that. Talk about which meetings you need to have when and where. When does being physically together matter the most? Maybe it's only quarterly for everyone to be together, including me from the Bahamas and Becky from 100 miles away. Or maybe it's once a month, depending on what you're doing. But weekly stand-ups might be completely virtual. You might have a place online where you post asynchronous updates so that you can all see what the priorities are for the week, what you did last week, what you're planning to do this week, what any blockers and barriers. That can all happen in a document online. And so maybe that's weekly. Maybe monthly you have a planning session, which is hybrid. Some people in the office, some people joining from elsewhere. Quarterly you get together and have much more of a social thing. But having those conversations, which may also include things like, how do we protect our focus time and make sure meetings don't creep everywhere? How do we make sure that we can signal availability when we do want to be contacted versus when we don't? All that stuff can really happen at a team level discussion, and then you can optimize for that team. But I think what a lot of organizations aren't doing is making it okay, whatever the result of that is. So they might not be making people feel that they can say that, Becky's only going to come in twice a quarter, Jane's only going to come in once a quarter, and somebody else is, 3 days when the guideline is 4, or, we have to be able to be open about it. So the ideal is that you have a culture that says it's okay to do this how you think it should be done. This is a guideline. This is the reason why it's a guideline and how it fits with our values and what we're trying to achieve as a business. But within that, we understand that life isn't so simple and that, people work in different ways, and we want to accommodate that. But tell us, if every manager reported honestly into a central system what people actually were doing, it would be an awful lot easier to model what the demand for spaces and amenities and events and what have you would be, because you'd have a realistic prediction of when people are actually going to come in, rather than this big broad mandate that everybody a chunk of people ignore.
Yeah. I think that manager piece is really important, isn't it? Because you've got, like you say, you've got those managers that don't feel they have that permission to steer off the organization's line on what hybrid working is and how many days are in a week. And then likely they're, lowering morale in their team, and they're not performing as well because, they don't feel they're getting the flexibility that they deserve. But also you do have a cohort of managers who are just covertly agreeing more flexible options that are against their organization's policy. So there's been some research recently from Robert Walters that shows a third of managers in the UK specifically are doing this kind of arrangement. So you've got these two kind of contrasting approaches from managers, and it just seems like they need a bit more training, more permission to have the freedom to just really set clear expectations that are nuanced, but, allow the team to work at their best.
I think that's true, because I definitely, managers are turning a blind eye. And to be honest, who wouldn't? If you've got a really high performing person in your team that's a real linchpin and does incredible work and is always growing and taking on responsibility, getting stuff done, and they're just a great person to work with, and they are coming in maybe 1 day here, 2 days there, whatever it is, and you've got a 3-day-a-week mandate, I wouldn't. You can see how you turn a blind eye and you just let that go, because at the end of the day, is it really going to be beneficial to the team, the company, the individual, the manager, or anyone to try and force that hand? Yeah. At the same time, if you have different managers doing different things, there's an element of that's not fair, which is also true. If you have some managers turning a blind eye, some managers strictly enforcing, then that creates a sense of unfairness. So I think that's kind of where the conversation needs to happen, in terms of managers having clear guardrails from the organization in terms of what's acceptable and what's not, but really trying to do that with an open mind in terms of making it psychologically safe to be honest and to be fair with that. Because I do think many of us would possibly turn a blind eye if somebody really hyper, and then we've got to ask ourselves, well, why are we doing it? If this person is performing really well, what is the point? What's the fixation on place? Now, we say it's to improve collaboration, and we say it's to improve culture, and those things can be true, but also we needn't forget that most people want to come into the office and want to see their colleagues at least some of the time. So the more positive we feel about the culture of trust, autonomy, and all the good stuff that we feel about working here, and we feel like we're respected and that we have some choice to choose how we work, that can actually make people want to come into the office more. There's an interesting study. It was a Dutch university, I think. The more they screwed down the mandates, some people, the less teams were less wanting to come in with. Whereas if they were actually, the more they could build a culture of trust, the more people wanted to be together. And you see this in some of the really cool high-performing cultures, high-performing companies. They have people really loving coming together in real life. So we just have to maybe think about how to collaborate more deliberately when it's a hybrid team, I think. Knowing where to find information, where to put information so that things are transparent regardless of place, regardless of time zone. And then making sure that when we come together, we're using that time in a way that it makes the most of that sort of premium physically together thing, make sure that we can socialize and have access to cool places with whiteboards and whatever we need, and just spend time with each other, connecting with building relationships and that sort of thing. You know, it's not like we just have to come in and sit there on Zoom calls 3 days a week for no reason. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think that it needs to be intentional, doesn't it? That togetherness. Okay, what are we doing then? What's the occasion that's bringing us together? How are we going to collaborate together? So,
yeah.
Which again, I don't think you get with a strict mandate where it's just, well, we've just got to come in on this day, even though we're going to spend the day on calls to other people.
Exactly. And it's a life stage thing to some extent as well. For example, if you're a young person starting out in your career, you want to learn from more experienced colleagues, and you want to be immersed in what the company's all about, and you want to bump into people, and you want to have some social time with your colleagues, and maybe you're sharing a house in a city with 5 other people, and it's not really a good work. Then you might want to be in the office the whole time. Whereas if you have somebody that's caring for an elderly parent and has 3 kids and is trying to balance their life, then maybe they will need more flexibility, and it shouldn't. But then there's also having managers take responsibility as mentors as part of that as well. And that's another conversation to have within teams. It's like, okay, we're just maybe a moment when togetherness really matters is onboarding a new colleague, or making sure that we do have time with these maybe less experienced colleagues to try and just have them absorb what this role and this team is all about, and maybe we make some moments around that. You know, it can't be just freestyle, do whatever you like, because that creates this kind of collaboration tax. But as long as we have those agreements and those responsibilities are taken seriously within a team and among leaders, then it can work really well.
I just want to briefly talk about, you mentioned that alignment piece at the start when you're setting that real top line, this is what we're going to do, this is our approach, and that there's a lot of different stakeholders there as part of that. And in the chat we had before the record, you mentioned that HR are quite often the ones that are pushing for more flexibility. They see the value in that, but maybe other stakeholders don't really see that as a powerful approach. What would be your kind of guidance on influencing that decision for HR?
Yeah, I mean, it's HR people are literally people. So they have they're more likely. This is not always true, of course, but there's a higher probability that they will have a deeper understanding of what makes people energized and what builds a culture and what creates engagement, because that's their whole thing. Whereas you might have stakeholders in IT, facilities, corporate real estate, who have a different sort of head on, and maybe you could even look at the same data set sometimes and draw a different conclusion. You know, say you did start to measure your policy, you have your policy stack in place and it's all defined where the guardrails are and how you set team agreements, how you set individual exceptions. Then you have the ability to measure that. And you do find that there's a big gap between what your policy says and what's actually happening in certain teams or in certain locations. Maybe you could have an HR person and say a CRE person look at that and draw kind of a different conclusion. Well, that means we should loosen this up a bit. And then somebody from corporate real estate is trying to increase utilization will say, nobody, we need to tighten it up. We need to bring more people. We need to try and make people come in more. But I do think the data, albeit that simple example, you can draw different conclusions from it. I do think being the person in the room who brings the data to the table is a big part of having your sphere of influence. I think it's a challenge in every area of every organization. This ballooning group of stakeholders in any given decision, because work is more complex, organizations are more complex, everything moves faster, we have more cross-functional collaboration, we have more technology that frees us up from administrative tasks so that we can be more strategic. And that's happened in HR, it's happened in marketing, it's happening in corporate real estate. You know, there's this constant, people are becoming more strategic, more cross-functional, decisions involve more stakeholders is just like a universal truth of the universe. So that means that it's very difficult to even align on what the definition of the problem is, let alone start to align on what the solutions might be. So I think maybe spending a little bit more time on what is the problem, defining the problem, like what are you trying to do here? And that's where you can look at things like like culture, like values, like your vision or your mission, or what are you trying to do as a company? What is your purpose? What's your ambition? Where do you want to go? And then use that to kind of underpin your strategy in terms of which will play out in your policies as well. But I think being the person who brings the data to the table and being the change maker in the room who can drive alignment across stakeholders, using data as evidence for reality. So you can bring your this is the actual compliance levels by team in terms of policy to the table. You can bring, utilization data to the table, engagement scores to the table and correlate that. And you can bring some scientific research to the table in terms of, these are legitimate and credible studies that show what happens when you screw down the mandates. These show what the difference in financial performance, what that looks like across companies based on flexibility. We can show how organizational health is impacted by flexibility and how organizational health correlates with being able to be an adaptable, change-making organization versus static and going downhill. So there's so much evidence in the world. So if you can bring that and tell a story around it and be the person in the room who's providing that clarity through defensible data that you're confident in communicating, I think that's probably the best way to align stakeholders. And then make sure that you take their worldview into account as well. Say at that alignment layer when you're setting policy, have each stakeholder independently say what their top 3 goals are for the workplace or for the policy or whatever it is you're trying, what are we trying to do here? And they'll all come with their different views and then get in a room and thrash out, well, how can we bring these 12, 3 each or whatever it is into 3 united goals that kind of tick all our boxes, and then let's make our policies from that point. So there's like alignment inherent in that.
Just before we wrap up, is there anything that we've not covered that you like, any final guidance tips that you think would be helpful for HR when they're looking this year to improve their hybrid working policy?
I think this is probably a good takeaway to land on, maybe to sum it up, is that we all talk now about really measuring outcomes rather than measuring time or monitoring what people are sitting at the computer or monitoring how often you're on Teams that's just such nonsense. And we say, really, it's more important to think about what are the outcomes here and who cares how it gets done, what are the outcomes? But then nobody knows how to measure productivity and how do we measure outcomes? And what I'd say to that is, you have to do a lot less than you think, because in an ideal scenario, when you have a hybrid team and you're working sometimes asynchronously, sometimes together, as a leader, you should understand the organization's goals, and you should understand the goals of the role that your department plays or your team plays in contributing to those wider goals. And so long as you have that clarity of understanding in terms of the wider strategy and the wider objectives, then you can sit there and think, okay, just have your team set their own goals. So instead of you having to sort of have this top-down change thing that has been actually, the most top-down change fails, 70% of it typically in all sorts of studies, I'd say, instead, forget that. If you're worried about outcomes and you're trying to create positive change ongoing in a continuous state of flux, have your team set their goals. Just paint a picture of what good looks like, and then have them set their own goals, track their own goals, measure their own, and share their own progress towards them. And to do that asynchronously. Then you have autonomy, clarity, and it's absolutely blatantly obvious who's doing what.
Thank you so much, Jane. We'll link to some helpful resources from HubStar and how people can connect with you as well around this video. So thank you so much.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Becky.